I heard the voice of Jesus say, "Come unto me and rest. Lay down thou weary one, lay down thy head upon my breast." I came to Jesus as I was, weary and worn and sad. I found in him a resting place, and he has made me glad. I heard the voice of Jesus say, "Behold, I freely give the living water, thirsty one, stoop down and drink and live." I came to Jesus and I drank of that life-giving stream. My thirst was quenched, my soul revived, and now I live with him.
Hello, welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy. Today we'll be in 1 Chronicles chapters 11 and 12. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please come if you can. We'll have masks available at the door for anyone who needs one. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also be meeting at 9 a.m. for classes for all ages, so please join us for those if you can. You're also welcome to join us to watch this class on the large screen in the auditorium at 9 a.m. We have many sick on the sick list, so please refer to our bulletin for more information about those. We want to give thanks for good news. My mother had successful eye surgery this past week, and I understand that Chuck Brazil had a good procedure done that restored some functionality to his heart. And I don't recall if I'd mentioned this to you all, but I believe I brought to your attention that my good friend David Garza, he's reported on Facebook that he's had a good report from his chemo results, so he's looking forward to transitioning to some other therapies and his cancer treatment. We've had an urgent request for prayers for Walker Allen, the son of Haley and Nate. He has been hospitalized for multiple viral infections and is on oxygen, so please keep him and his family in your prayers. Also, continue to pray for Sarah Amix, Camden Wilson, Marianne Kinsey, Paula Everett, and April Askew. As is our custom, we want to keep in our thoughts the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined by a third man on the way. Turned out that third man was Jesus, and as those men recollected their journey with him, they recalled that there had been a burning in their hearts while he was present with them. It's that burning that they had in their hearts that we hope to kindle in our own hearts as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of his word. We want to remember the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy for the Lord our God is holy. And we want to remember the stories of Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and the prophet that came to Jeroboam. There's nothing more telling than the story of a man like Rehoboam who took advice from what he considered to be wise young people who did not know how to behave before the public that they controlled. The implications to that on our government today and the way we live our lives today cannot be underestimated. The story of Jeroboam likewise has key elements to it that we need to always keep in mind as we go about our daily lives, seeking to serve the Lord. Jeroboam had been given a promise that if he abided with the Lord, his kingdom would be as great as David's. His role in the kingdom would be as great as David's. These things he received from the Lord. He took the northern kingdom when the northern tribes split away from Judah, and he was king over them. And immediately he decided that it was bad for the people to go into Jerusalem to worship God according to the law. And he set up high places in the mountains and set up a false priesthood to support those high places in the mountains, and told the people that the God that led their forefathers out of the land of Egypt, out of captivity, into the freedom and blessing of the promised land, should be worshipped in those mountains, should be worshipped at those high places with this false priesthood. This was an abomination before the Lord until the time of Christ. It was wrong for the people to do that, and that king's leadership, Jeroboam's leadership in this regard, led the people into sin for centuries. It's a terrible thing to do something that we consider convenient or right in our way of thinking instead of what the Lord has told us to do, we should always be on guard for this kind of false behavior, false belief, false doctrine. And finally, the story of the prophet that came to Jeroboam. God didn't just let Jeroboam do what he wanted to do. He sent a prophet to tell him not to do it. And that prophet did everything he had been told to do and had one thing left to do, to go home by a different path than he'd come. And instead of going all the way home, he was met in the way by another prophet from Israel who wanted the honor of his company. And that prophet convinced him that he should stop and join him for a meal. And God judged him. God took his life because he'd made that mistake. It's a terrible thing to find that all of your work is ruined by one action, one failure of faith, one failure of obedience. We take this to heart, and as teachers, I take it to heart. I don't want you to believe anything because I've said it. I want you to take what I've said to the Word, look at it, examine it, make sure that what I've said is in accord with the Word before you take anything away from my ideas about what we're studying as truth, as helpful even. Don't believe anything I say unless it's in accord with God's Word. And if you find that I've said something that is not in accord with God's Word, please come and tell me. Please contact me and let me know, and let's study together and find out the truth. I hope you will find a word of encouragement in today's study. We're going to do something slightly different than normal. I won't be reading all of 1 Chronicles 11 and 12. I'll read a short passage out of the first part of chapter 11, and then we'll discuss the rest of it. Much of it is covered again in 2 Samuel and other places, so we won't spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to cover it for the slight differences that it does contain in 1 Chronicles that are already significant to the story that we've read thus far in 2 Samuel. And hopefully I've kept my firsts and seconds in order this time. So please be patient with me in that regard. I know that I may misstate a Bible chapter or source, inadvertently calling 1 Samuel out instead of 2 Samuel, and probably 2 Chronicles instead of 1 Chronicles. Please bear with me in that, and I apologize for that. 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord your God said to you, You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over my people Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. Verse 4. And David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is, Jebus, where the Jebusites were, the inhabitants of the land. The inhabitants of Jebus said to David, You will not come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. David said, Whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander. And Joab the son of Zeruiah went up first, so he became chief. And David lived in the stronghold. Therefore it was called the city of David. And he built the city all around from the Milo in complete circuit. And Joab repaired the rest of the city. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. Okay, so last time in 1 Chronicles we read about the death of Saul, which is in chapter 10. Now we see a repeat of basically what we've read out of 2 Samuel already, the anointing of David as king, and the taking of Jerusalem by David as his home city. Now there's some interesting things that are slightly different here. They leave out the whole story of David ruling over Judah for 7.5 years before becoming king over all of Israel. They leave out the war between Abner and David. They leave out the whole story of Abner's death and the significant things that David had said about Joab, about killing Abner, are all left out here. They're not recorded here. And that may be reflective of the intent of 1 Chronicles. Now, we talked about this before, about a year ago, First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, they were all called Chronicles at one point. This book of Chronicles was a book that was written in the time of the captivity, either shortly before or during the return from captivity of Israel to Jerusalem. So there's likely to be a motivation here, something other than the motivation of the writers who chronicled these same stories in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Here, I'm going to say Ezra did this because it's attributed to Ezra in several of the commentaries that I've read. Ezra takes these stories that have been compiled into the Chronicles, which are condensed and sometimes focused on different aspects of the same stories recorded in the Kings and Samuel. And he's telling this story in such a way as to encourage the people in their return to Judah and Jerusalem. And they were going to have to do a lot of work when they got there. And if you'll recall the story of Ezra, it was a great thing that lay before them to do. They had to go back to Jerusalem and fix Jerusalem. And so this encouragement about restoring Jerusalem is rooted here, I believe, in this story of how David built Jerusalem in the first place. So they focus kind of on that here in the first part of 1 Chronicles chapter 11. They don't focus on the divisiveness and the divided nature of that first 7.5 years. And it is a sad thing, as I've said for the past few weeks, to see a nation that should be unified divided because of the egos of a very few men. The people of Israel needed to be united, and now they were going to be united under the leader David, according to the word of the Lord by Samuel revealed, as is recorded in verse 3. What an incredible thing the Lord did in bringing the people together under the control of David to raise them up to be a power among the peoples of the earth right here in Israel. It goes on into this story of David's mighty men in chapter 11. Now, this is a story that is again recounted in Samuel at the end of David's reign, and I don't know why the discrepancy of order is here. And in my reading of it, it is incomplete. It is not as complete a telling of the story here in 1 Chronicles as is found in, I believe it's 2 Samuel chapter 23. But we'll go over it briefly. First of all, there are these chiefs of David's mighty men who were 3 men. The first of them is mentioned here as Jashobeam or Jashobeam. Hachmonite was chief of the 3. And this man is recorded with a slightly different name in 2 Samuel, as I recall. And it says he wielded a spear against 300 of whom he killed at one time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these stories because, again, we will be covering them out of 2 Samuel in a few weeks down the road anyway. And here, again, I think the story is a little incomplete. So we'll just keep moving on. The second of those 3 mighty men was Eleazar or Eleazar, depending on how you pronounce Eleazar, the son of Dodo the Ahohite. And I don't know the pronunciation there, so I'm going to say Dodo because it does come up again later. He was with David at Pasdammim when the Philistines were gathered there for a battle. And if I'm not mistaken, and according to what I did briefly read out of 2 Samuel, this is the story of where David had joined the Philistines to fight against Saul, and the Philistine army did not want David there. And so this is where they left there. And then there's a recounting of a story here that is incomplete and not consistent with the story that is found in a more complete form in 2 Samuel. And the third of the 3 is not mentioned here by name. So there are these 3 men who were these leaders, Jashobeam, I'm going to say Jashobeam, and Eleazar, and the third one is not mentioned by name, and I don't recall the name, so I'm not going to say it now. So I'm not going to attempt to say it now. These were three in charge of these 30 mighty men that it's mentioned in verse 15. Three of the 30 chief men, they went down to a rock where David was in the cave of Adullam when the army of the Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. David was in the stronghold and wanted a drink from a well in Bethlehem. And David said something to that effect. The men heard that, and these three mighty men broke through the barricade of the Philistines, drew the water from the well in Bethlehem that was at the gate, and brought it back to David. And it says in verse 18, toward the end of the verse, but David would not drink it. He poured it out to the Lord and said, far be it from me before my God that I should do this. Shall I drink the lifeblood of these men? For at the risk of their lives they brought it. Therefore he would not drink it. So this was not intended as an insult to these men, but an honor to them and the sacrifice and the risk that they had taken in order to bring this water to David. Now, in verse 20, we see a reference to Abishai, the brother of Joab, who was one of the chiefs among the 30, but not of the three. And it's said here in such a way as to show that he was very significant, and yet he was not one of the three. And they do this again in verse 22 about Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, who was a valiant man of Kabzeel, a doer of great deeds. He struck down some Moabites and struck down an Egyptian of great stature, a giant. This Egyptian had in his hand a spear like a weaver's beam, so very much like Goliath, but in this case he was an Egyptian rather than a Philistine. And he was renowned among the 30, but he did not attain to the three in verse 25, and David set him over his bodyguard. So this is an indication, I think. He's telling these great stories about these two men and saying that these two men did these great things, and yet they did not attain to the greatness of the three. So that was a way of elevating the three without telling even more stories about the three, and still drawing attention to these other men who were great men of valor as well. It goes on to mention Asahel, the brother of Joab, and Abishai, which is interesting again because now David has been made king over all of Israel, and at that very particular point Asahel was dead because he had fought with Abner in the battle at Pool. I don't know the Bethsaida Pool. I'm not sure what pool it was off the top of my head. But there had been a battle there that we read about a few weeks ago, and Asahel pursued Abner, and Abner begged him not to, and when Asahel refused to relent, Abner killed him. And that resulted in the anger that Joab felt specifically toward Abner that resulted in Abner being killed by Joab. But here Asahel is mentioned as a member of the 30. So this is an interesting thing. There proceeds after verse 28 to be a list of names, and there are more than 30 names there, more like 40 names. So this is an interesting thing. And it may be that these were men who were all part of these 30 men at different times, or it may be that the name 30 men of valor, these 30 mighty men of valor, was like a name of a unit in the military, like the Big Red One, or any of a number of other unit names that organizations of men in the military have assigned to them as a label. So this name of 30 mighty men may not have been 30 literal men. It might have been a group of men that were known as the 30 men. And I don't know that, I don't understand that, and I'm just trying to come up with some kind of rational explanation. Other men of note that we'll be reading about later on and may include Nathan, who is not listed as one of the mighty men, but instead as the brother of Joel, I'm not sure if that's the same Nathan that will later come to David as a prophet, or if that's a different Nathan altogether. So there's several Nathans, I think. And of course, there's Uriah the Hittite, who was to play a major role in the shortcomings of David later on. So these are the mighty men of valor that are listed here. And again, these would have been heroes in name to all of the Israelites in captivity. They would have known these men from the stories recounted in their meetings together. These stories would have lived orally, if not in books and records that were kept that detailed more exactly some of these stories that we only have hints of now. But these men were known, and these men would have been a tremendous encouragement to a people returning from captivity, looking for a source of encouragement, a source of seeing how God lived in the lives of men and made use of these men to make Israel great at one point. Going on into chapter 12, the story of David at Ziklag is recounted here, and it talks about how additional men kept coming and joining David. And it goes on talking about all these additional men, and some of these are significant men who will come into play later on by name. And again, there's so many of them, it's just a bit overwhelming. And there's also mention of certain groups like the Korathites, who play a significant role as members of other groups. So we have to keep track of some of that and the way we think about the roles that are played among the men that were serving David. David just didn't go out and grab men from whatever place that he could grab them. Instead, they were coming to him, and he built an army from these men that came to him that was a significant army, and we're fixing to read about the significance of the size of that army here at the end of chapter 12. Going on, it says in verse 18, the Spirit clothed Amasai, chief of the 30, who was chief of the 30 maybe at that time, and he said these things, speaking of all these men who had presented themselves to David over all of these events. We are yours, O David, and with you, O son of Jesse. Peace, peace to you, and peace to your helpers, for your God helps you. So all these men, all the people of Israel, all of these people who would open their eyes and see, saw that David was being lifted up by God, saw that God was working through this man David that he had set up, that he'd had anointed by the hand of Samuel, that he had prophesied to through Samuel about. David was now receiving what the Lord had promised, and they were all very excited about it. And it started even at this early point when David was still not even king of Judah. There was this thing going on at Ziklag. This is before the 7.5 years, and there were men defecting from the ranks of Saul's army and joining David. And of course there are other names, and there are some significant names here, and there are so many significant names it's hard to really keep track of or even look them all up. Some of them sound very significant, and they may be similar names for different people that come back later, and that's always a factor. It's never really clear unless they go to the trouble of explaining who it is and why they're mentioning them at this point in time. It's not easy to make the connection that it is the same person that you'll see later on. But it said in the end of verse 18, David received them and made them officers of his troop. These people that came to him and made this vow essentially toward David, and these were from the tribe of Benjamin. Of course, that being the house, the parent house of Saul's house, and the parent house of Abner's rule over Israel through Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. Going on into verse 19, other men came from Manasseh, and they did something similar. They made these vows toward David, And then it goes into these numbers. So the numbers are recounted here, starting in verse 23. The men of Judah presenting themselves to David were 6,800 armed troops. Of the Simeonites, and this is now in verse 25, mighty men of valor for war, 7,100. Of the Levites, and remember the Levites are the priesthood, so they don't have a significant land promise. They had some cities and the lands immediately around a few cities, but they, as a people, were scattered abroad, scattered over the lands to serve the people as priests. 4,600 Levites. The prince Jehoiada of the house of Aaron, and with him 3,700. So I don't know if those 3,700 are a subset of the 4,600, or if that's an additional 3,700 aside from the 4,600 Levites previously mentioned. Of the Benjaminites in verse 29, again, the kinsmen of Saul, 3,000, of whom the majority had at that point kept their allegiance to the house of Saul. So they weren't betrayers of the house of Saul. Of the Ephraimites, 20,800 mighty men of valor, famous men in their fathers' houses. Of the half tribe of Manasseh, 18,000. And that is apparently of the tribe that was on the west side of the Jordan, who were expressly named to come and make David king. In verse 32, of Issachar, men who had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do, 200 chiefs and all their kingsmen under their command. So not as many people, but they had significant capabilities apparently. Of Zebulun, 50,000 seasoned troops equipped for battle, all with weapons of war to help David, with singleness of purpose, it says in verse 33. Of Naphtali, 1,000 commanders, with whom were 37,000 men armed with shield and spear. Of the Danites, 28,600 men equipped for battle. Of Asher, 40,000 seasoned troops ready for battle. Of the Reubenites, Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, from the other side of the Jordan, 120,000 men armed with all weapons of war. All of these men, it says in verse 38, men of war arrayed in battle order, came to Hebron with a whole heart to make David king over all Israel. Likewise, all the rest of Israel were of a single mind to make David king. And they were there with David for 3 days, eating and drinking, for their brothers had made preparation for them, and also their relatives from as far as Issachar and Zebulun and Naphtali came bringing food on donkeys and on camels and mules and oxen, abundant provisions of flour, cakes of figs, clusters of raisins and wine and oil and oxen, sheep, for there was joy in Israel. The unity that they'd looked for was being delivered to them by God, and there was joy in Israel. What an encouragement this must have been to the Israelites that were returning to Israel from captivity, to hear about all these wonderful things that these people could do together, the mighty men that could be brought together in service of the King if they would only trust in the Lord. If they would only trust in the Lord. If we would only trust in the Lord, what things could we do? What things could we see God do through our hands for His glory? I hope you found a word of encouragement in today's lesson. First Chronicles is a little bit harder for me to read through than the books of Samuel and Kings, but we'll do our best to keep abreast of the things that are unfolding in First Chronicles, as well as the story as it unfolds in 2 Samuel. So next week we'll go on and study further in 2 Samuel. I hope you've found some word of encouragement here in this lesson today. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless and have a great week.